They laid the twin pups in their coffins at dawn, when the rain was still gentle enough to pretend it was mercy. The Alpha King's children, his heirs, his blood, and every warrior who stepped forward to lower them into the cold earth was thrown back. Not gently, not with warning. The first Alpha, 7 feet of iron muscle, a soldier who had carried dying men off battlefields without flinching, was hurled 6 feet through the air the moment his hands touched the carved stone lid. He hit the courtyard pillar so hard the ancient granite cracked. He didn't get up for a long time. The second tried anyway. They always did when pride was involved. He made it 3 steps closer before something, invisible, electric, wrong, seized his chest like a fist closing around his heart and squeezed. He dropped to his knees in the rain, gasping, crawling backward through the mud while grown wolves watched in silence and did nothing, because there was nothing to do. By the 6th attempt, no one was volunteering anymore. The twin pups lay in their coffin between the crumbling stone pillars of the palace courtyard, in the rain, going nowhere. The earth would not receive them. The kingdom stood in a circle around that small, ornate box and felt something older than fear settle into their bones. Cursed, they whispered. The pups are cursed. Even death won't claim them. Alpha King Ray stood at the edge of the circle and said nothing. He was a mountain of dark armor and silence, his fur-lined mantle soaked through, his jagged crown catching no light because the sky had swallowed the sun whole. His jaw was stone. His eyes were the kind of empty that lives on the other side of unbearable grief, past tears, past rage, in the hollow country where a man goes when the world has taken everything and is apparently not finished. His hand rested near the hilt of his sword, not to draw it, just because it was the only thing left to hold on to. No one spoke to him. No one dared. Prince Tommy stood at the king's right shoulder, his expression arranged into something that looked like mourning if you didn't study it too carefully. He watched the warriors fail one by one with eyes that were just slightly too calm, too calculating, too patient for a man watching his nephews refuse to be buried. No one noticed. Everyone was watching the coffin. No one was watching the maid. Sherry had been invisible for so long she sometimes forgot she had a face. She moved through the circle of mourners the way water moves through cracks, finding the spaces between important people, filling them briefly, disappearing before anyone registered she had ever been there. Her dress was pale linen, simple and servant plain, soaked dark at the hem from the puddles she'd been kneeling in since before sunrise. Her hair hung straight and loose around her face, heavy with rain, a curtain she'd learned to hide behind young. She was supposed to be clearing the mud from the ceremonial stones. That was the task she'd been given. Someone has to keep the courtyard clean during the burial, the head steward had said, without quite looking at her, the way no one quite looked at her since her father Melvin had dragged her to the pack boundary 2 winters ago and left her there like something he'd found in his shoe. Aberrant, he'd called her gift. Contaminated. Her sister Chandra had watched from the doorway with a small, satisfied smile. Neither of them had raised a voice in her defense. In the hierarchy of this kingdom, rejected Omegas ranked somewhere below the mud Sherry was currently scrubbing. She knew this. She had stopped arguing with it. She wrung out her cloth and moved closer to the coffin to clean the stones around its base, because no one told her not to, because no one told her anything at all, because she was furniture. That's when she heard it. She froze. It was faint, so impossibly faint that for a moment she thought she'd invented it, the way you invent sounds in silence when grief has been pressing on you too long. A rhythm. Delicate, stuttering, 2 rhythms, synchronized, faint as moth wings against glass, quiet as the space between heartbeats. Sherry set down her cloth very slowly and pressed her palm flat against the rain-slicked stone beside the coffin. The dark pulse that had thrown 6 grown alphas backward like ragdolls washed over her hand like cold water. She felt it shudder against her skin, felt it test her, and then, puzzlingly, uncertainly, go still. It recognized something in her, or perhaps it recognized that there was nothing in her it could use. No fear. She had spent 2 winters alone at the edge of the forest learning not to be afraid of things that wanted to hurt her, because fear was a luxury that got you killed. She leaned closer to the coffin lid. The heartbeats came again. Faint. Desperate. Alive. Sherry sat back on her heels in the rain, her hands still resting against the stone that had broken 6 warriors, and understood, with the quiet, terrible clarity that sometimes only the truly invisible possess, that the Alpha King's children were not dead. They were screaming, somewhere beneath layers of dark magic, and she was the only person in this entire grieving kingdom who could hear them. She looked up. Through the curtain of her wet hair, she found King Ray's face across the courtyard, that stone-cold devastation, that hand on the hilt of a sword he had nothing left to fight, and felt something shift inside her chest. Someone has to. The rain came down harder. The torches flickered against the mist-wrapped castle walls. The warriors stood in their useless circle, and the mourners whispered their useless curses, and Prince Tommy watched the coffin with his patient, careful eyes. And Sherry, the Omega maid that no one saw, pressed both hands against the forbidden stone and began to understand exactly what kind of darkness she was going to have to walk into. She had been below the dirt her entire life. Perhaps that was exactly what this required. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know if our story reaches as far as America, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Africa. No one told Sherry to stop cleaning. That was the thing about being invisible. No one ever told you to do anything, and no one ever told you to stop. You simply moved through the spaces the important people left behind, filling them with quiet labor, and the world continued turning without once acknowledging that you were part of it. So when the warriors gave up and the mourners drifted back toward the palace warmth and the circle around the twin coffins slowly dissolved into twos and threes of whispered conversation, Sherry was still there. Still on her knees, still pressing her cloth against the ceremonial stones in slow, methodical circles while the rain turned everything to gray. The head steward had long since gone inside. She doubted he remembered he'd assigned her here at all. The coffin sat alone on its stone platform in the center of the courtyard, the carved wolf heads along its lid streaming with rainwater, the ornate silver clasps gone dark in the overcast light. Someone had placed white flowers around the base that morning, proper funeral blossoms, the kind that cost more than Sherry earned in a month. The rain had already beaten them flat. She worked her way closer without deciding to. Her cloth moved across the stones. Her knees ached from the cold wet ground. She was perhaps 4 feet from the coffin's edge when she paused to wring the cloth out and, in the brief silence between one sweep of rain and the next, she heard it again. There and gone. Quiet as a candle flame in wind. Thump, thump, and then, a half-breath behind it, an echo, thump, thump, so perfectly synchronized it raised the hair on her arms beneath her soaked sleeves. Sherry sat very still. She was not imagining it. She had spent enough time in genuine silence, 2 winters of it, alone, in the forest where the pack boundary stones marked the edge of the world she was permitted to occupy, to know the difference between the sounds the mind invents in loneliness and the sounds the world actually makes. This was real. This was close. This was coming from inside the coffin. She set the cloth down on the stones. Her hands were red from the cold, the knuckles cracked, the nails bitten short from the habit she'd never managed to break. Not healer's hands, by any measure. Not the kind of hands people looked at and thought she could save something. She pressed them flat against the wet stone platform and leaned in, tilting her head the way she used to as a child when she would press her ear to the walls of her father's house and listen to the world he'd decided she wasn't part of. The heartbeats came again. 2 of them. Both faint. Both slowing in the particular way that things slow when they are running out of time rather than simply resting. There was a difference. She had always been able to feel that difference, had known it from the time she was small and her hands would find sick animals in the forest and the wrongness in them would sing against her palms like a plucked string. Her gift. Her curse. The thing her father called contamination and her sister called dangerous and the pack elders called something that couldn't be spoken in polite company. She had spent 2 years trying to believe they were right. Sitting in the rain beside the Alpha King's children, listening to their heartbeats flutter like trapped birds against the inside of their own coffin, she found that she couldn't sustain the belief anymore. The sleeping plague. That was what they'd called it. A mysterious illness, sudden and total, that had taken both pups within hours of each other 3 days ago. The palace healers had been called. The royal physicians had been summoned. Every alpha with any knowledge of wolf medicine had been brought before the king, and every one of them had arrived at the same terrible conclusion. The pups were gone, and the sleeping plague was merciless and complete, and there was nothing to be done but grieve. Sherry had scrubbed the corridor outside the healer's chamber during 3 of those consultations. She'd been invisible then too, moving her mop in slow arcs while important men spoke over her head, and she had listened without seeming to, the way you learned to listen when you existed below the threshold of other people's attention. She had thought, at the time, that something was wrong with the diagnosis. The healers had spoken with a confidence that didn't match their eyes. There had been a tightness around their mouths, a carefulness to their language, that felt less like grief and more like people describing something they'd been told to describe. She hadn't said anything. She was a maid, a rejected omega. Below the dirt, she pressed her ear as close to the coffin lid as she dared without touching it and listened. Thump. Slower now. Both of them, slowing together, bound by whatever dark thing held them in this almost death. Not plague, not illness. Something deliberate, something constructed, something that could, in theory, be taken apart. Sherry sat back and looked at the coffin for a long moment. Then she looked at the dark pulse that shimmered around it like heat off summer stone, invisible to everyone who'd been watching earlier, but not to her. She'd always been able to see the shape of wrong things. Another feature of her contamination. The pulse was thick and layered, like something braided from multiple sources, and at its center, threading through it like a wire through dark wool, she could feel a cold intelligence. This wasn't wild magic. This wasn't some curse that had grown naturally from grief or fear or the terrible accidents that happened in a world where power moved through bloodlines and sometimes curdled. This was Maid. Someone had built this. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing had sat down with intention and constructed the specific mechanism that was killing the Alpha King's children one slowing heartbeat at a time. She looked up at the palace. The windows stared back, blank and gray. Then she reached out and touched the coffin. She'd expected the impact. She'd watched 6 warriors get thrown clear of this platform in the span of an hour, and she was under no illusions about her own significance in the hierarchy of power. If anything, she'd assumed it would be worse for her, that the darkness would find her smaller and easier to break and would break her accordingly. Instead, the pulse hit her palm and stopped. Not gently. It was still cold, still wrong. It pressed against her skin with the particular weight of magic that had been built for violence, testing her the way a guard dog tests a fence, looking for the weakness where it could push through. She felt it move up her wrist, felt it taste something in her blood, and then, confusion. That was the only word for what she sensed in it. A specific, bewildered hesitation, like a predator that had never encountered prey that simply absorbed its strike and looked back calmly. Her gift had always worked this way. She didn't fight wrong things. She didn't push against them. She took them in, the pain, the illness, the dark energy, and held it somewhere inside herself where it dissolved into nothing, the way a deep river swallows a stone without changing its course. Her father had called it aberrant. Her grandmother, in the old journals Sherry had memorized before they were burned, had called it the oldest kind of healing. The kind that predated wolf medicine and royal physicians and everything the modern pack had decided counted as legitimate power. The barrier shuddered against her hand. It did not throw her back. Sherry exhaled very slowly and pressed her palm flatter against the lid. The carved wolf heads were cold against her skin. The rain came down around her in curtains. She could feel the dark pulse trying to find purchase in her, trying to locate the fear that fed it, and she gave it nothing to grip because fear required caring about her own survival, and she had learned, painfully, over 2 winter-long lessons in abandonment, that surviving and caring about surviving were not always the same thing. The second heartbeat fluttered against her palm. Closer now. Aware of her, somehow, in the way that small living things sense warmth. I hear you, she thought, not in words exactly, but in the wordless language of her gift. I hear both of you. I'm here. The barrier thinned. Just slightly, just enough. She didn't push. She waited. That was when a voice came from behind her, low and rough with a grief that had been ground down into something harder than tears. Step away from that coffin. She turned slowly, because sudden movements around armed wolves tended to end conversations before they started. He was standing at the courtyard entrance, half hidden by the column's shadow, and for a moment she didn't recognize him because he looked nothing like the portrait in the east corridor that she'd dusted 100 times. The portrait showed Prince Russell upright and composed in formal silver-edged armor, his dark hair arranged, his expression the carefully neutral one that royalty learned young. The man in the rain looked like something that had been built to those specifications and then put through something the specifications hadn't accounted for. He was tall, not as tall as his father, but close, with the same dark coloring and the same quality of compressed strength, the sense that the body had been built for war and had spent years proving it. But the armor he wore tonight was functional and plain, stripped of ceremony, and his face was the face of someone who had not slept in 3 days and had stopped expecting to. His eyes, when they found her, were the color of deep water, dark, still, and in their stillness, something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not the reflexive contempt that alphas usually pointed at omegas out of pure habit. Something closer to desperate attention, the way drowning people look at anything that might be solid. She realized he had been watching her from the shadows. He had seen her touch the coffin. He had seen the barrier fail to throw her back. "I said step away," he repeated, but the command had lost its edge somewhere between his chest and his mouth. He moved toward her, and she watched him clock the fact that she was still touching the lid, that the dark pulse was still shimmering around the platform, and that she was not, by any observable measure, dying from it. He stopped a few feet away. In the rain, his dark hair was flat against his forehead. There was a cut along his jaw that hadn't been tended properly, the kind of wound a man forgets about when larger things are demanding his attention. "You're a maid," he said. It wasn't an insult. It was a man trying to organize facts that weren't arranging themselves into sense. "Yes, my lord." The barrier, he stopped, started again. 6 of my father's finest warriors couldn't touch that coffin. The head physician lasted less than a minute before the curse dropped him. His eyes moved to her hand, still resting flat on the lid. "You're standing there like you're petting a dog." She almost said, "I've been bitten by enough real things that this doesn't frighten me," but that seemed like the wrong moment for honesty about her personal history. Instead, she said, "I can hear them, my lord." The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when something enormous lands in a small space. "Hear them." His voice had gone very quiet. "Their heartbeats. Both of them." She watched his face change, watched the careful grief mask crack along lines that had been under pressure for 3 days, and pressed on before he could stop her or dismiss her or do any of the things powerful people did when impossible information arrived from powerless sources. "They're alive. Slowing, but alive. Whatever is in this coffin with them, it isn't the sleeping plague. That's not what this is." He crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 steps. His hand came up as if to grab her arm and then stopped, hovering, because she was still touching the coffin and he clearly had no idea what would happen if he touched her while she was touching it, and that caution told her something important about him. That he was afraid, but he was thinking through his fear rather than past it. "You can hear their heartbeats," he said again, slower, working it. "Yes. And you can touch the coffin." "Yes." "Why?" And the way he said it wasn't the dismissive "why would I believe a maid" that she'd half expected. It was the raw, stripped open why of a man who has been standing in front of a locked door for 3 days and will take the key from literally any hand that offers it. Sherry looked at Prince Russell, at the grief in him, honest and enormous, the kind that didn't perform itself, and made a decision that her 2 years of careful, self-protective invisibility argued loudly against. "Because of what I am," she said, "and what I can do. If you'll let me explain." He looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes, beneath the exhaustion and the fracture lines of grief, she saw it, what he'd seen in her, she supposed, when he'd been watching from the shadows. Something he couldn't categorize. Something old. "Come with me," he said quietly. "There are ears in every corridor of this palace, and I don't yet know which of them are safe." He pulled his cloak from his shoulders and, without ceremony or self-consciousness, dropped it around hers. It was a purely practical gesture. She was soaked through and shivering and he had armor beneath, and dead maids told no one anything, but it startled her so completely that she stood frozen for a full second before her feet remembered how to move. She lifted her hand from the coffin carefully. The barrier shimmered back into place behind her palm, sealing the dark pulse back around the box. The heartbeats faded from her range, but she held their rhythm in her memory like a thread she refused to drop. She followed the prince into the palace. He took her to a room that smelled of old books and cold hearth ash, small and high-windowed, the kind of place a child might have used as a hiding spot and a grown man returned to when the world became too loud. A single oil lamp on the desk, a chair with a cracked leg propped against the wall, shelves of leather-bound volumes that had been read rather than displayed. He didn't sit. He stood with his back to the door after he'd locked it, his arms crossed, watching her with that same careful, drowning attention. She told him about her gift in the plain, factual way she'd learned to describe things she'd spent years being ashamed of. She could absorb pain. Not just emotional pain, physical suffering, illness, dark energy, the particular wrongness that settled in a body when something bad had been done to it. She took it in through her hands and it dissolved inside her, leaving the afflicted body cleaner. She didn't know why. She hadn't chosen it. It had always been there. From the time she was a small girl and sick animals stopped dying when she held them. From the time she was older and the dying wolves in her pack's infirmary started rallying when she slipped in at night to sit beside them. from the time her father brought the healers to examine her, and they all agreed, in varying language with a consistent tone of unease, that what she had wasn't medicine. "What do they call it?" Russell asked. He hadn't moved from the door. "Contamination," she said. "My father's word. The pack elders said I had old blood in me." "Witch blood," they called it, from before the wolf lines were settled. "They said it was dangerous." She paused. "They weren't entirely wrong. I can absorb dark magic. I can hold it. What I can't always control is what it does to me while I'm holding it." Something shifted in his posture. "It can hurt you. Depending on what it is and how much of it there is, yes." She said it as a fact, not a confession. She'd learned that flinching while delivering difficult information only made the listener focus on the flinch. "What's in that coffin is strong, layered, built by someone who knows what they're doing. I'd need to understand more of what it is before I'd know what it would cost me to take it apart." He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and removed a small, sealed case she recognized, the kind palace physicians used for close examination of the deceased. Glass-lensed instruments, magnification tools, the things that let you look at a body without touching it. "Then we look first," he said, "before anything else." She understood then that he believed her. Not cautiously, not provisionally, but completely, in the way people believe things that match a truth they'd been trying to articulate and couldn't find the words for. He'd been in that courtyard for 3 days watching warriors bounce off his children's coffin, and he'd known, she could see it in him now, in the set of his jaw and the too controlled way he moved, that something was wrong beyond wrong. Not cursed. Not plague. Engineered. He just needed someone else to say it first. "My father," he said, not looking at her, gathering the case and an additional lamp, "cannot know about this yet. If what you're suggesting is true, if someone inside this palace has done this, then the fewer people who know we're looking, the longer we stay alive to keep looking." He glanced back at her. "Can I trust that?" "My lord," she said, "I have spent 2 years being someone nobody notices. I am very good at secrets." They went back to the coffin in the dead of the palace's night, when the guards had rotated to the inner corridors and the courtyard lay empty and rain-glazed under a sky the color of pewter. Russell carried the physician's case. Sherry went ahead, because she could pass through the barrier and he couldn't, and because, she noted without emotion, he positioned himself between her and the courtyard entrance at every stage, body angled outward like a shield, protecting a maid. A rejected omega, below the dirt. She filed that away and didn't examine it yet. At the coffin, she pressed both palms against the lid and worked the barrier back the way she'd done before, not fighting it, absorbing its surface aggression until it quieted against her skin like a spooked animal going still. It took longer this time. Whatever intelligence was woven into it had registered her touch from earlier and was less confused now, more resistant. She felt it press back with deliberate force, cold and specific, targeting the places in her it recognized as vulnerable. The old wound of rejection. The deep-worn groove of self-doubt. The part of her that had almost believed her father when he said she was wrong. She breathed through it, let it find nothing to grip. The barrier thinned. "Now," she said quietly. Russell moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold air. He passed the glass lens over the coffin lid. The physician's tools worked without touching the surface itself, and tilted the lamp to throw the light at the angle that would pierce the glass panel set into the coffin's upper third. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The pups lay inside on white funeral cloth, pale and terribly small, their eyes closed, their faces arranged in the too perfect stillness of deep unconsciousness rather than the subtle stiffness of actual death. They were identical in the way twins are when you first see them together, a doubled image, each the mirror of the other, each wearing an expression that looked, heartbreakingly, more like sleep than like dying. But their skin. Russell made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Low. Involuntary. Sherry leaned closer. The black lines ran from the inside of each pup's wrist up along the inner forearm, branching like the roots of something that had been growing in them for days. Not veins. The lines followed no natural vascular path. They moved in patterns, deliberate angles, the specific geometric language of constructed magic rather than biological process. She had seen something like it once before, in her grandmother's journals, in a passage that had been partially burned before Sherry had managed to read it. A single term, written in the old script that predated the modern pack dialects. Nightshade venom. Not a poison that killed. A poison that held. that suspended the body in a state so deep it mimicked rigor mortis, slowed the heart, cooled the skin, shut down the higher functions, while leaving the core alive, burning at the lowest possible flame. A paralytic so complete that even wolf senses couldn't reliably detect the difference. And the lines were spreading. She could see it now, the newest threads, fainter than the established ones, pushing slowly toward the pup's chests, toward the heart. Nightshade Curse, she said. Her own voice sounded very calm, which surprised her. Someone administered it and then layered a binding over it to sustain the paralysis. That's what the barrier is. It's not protecting a burial. It's maintaining the mechanism that's keeping them in this state. She paused, working through the rest of it. The barrier feeds on the fear of anyone who approaches it. The stronger the alpha who tries to touch it, the more fear they carry. Fear of what it means if they fail, fear of what they'll have to tell the king, and the more that fear gives the barrier to work with. It grows with every failed attempt, which is why the warriors kept getting thrown harder each time, Russell said. His voice had taken on the dangerous quiet of someone who has just understood the shape of a trap they've been standing in. Every time someone tried to bury them, they fed it. Yes, and you. I came in with nothing it could use. She said it plainly. Fear requires something to lose. I'd already lost everything before I walked into that courtyard. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she met it without flinching because she had learned that the truth, stated simply, was harder to argue with than any defense she could construct. Can you break it? He asked. The binding. I need to understand all of it first. There's something else in here, another layer beneath the nightshade. She pressed her palms flat and let her gift push deeper, past the surface aggression of the barrier, past the cold geometry of the curse itself, into the foundation layer where the magic was anchored. There, that's the root of it. She frowned. It's tied to something emotional, something relational. A bond, not a bloodline, more specific than that. She felt along the anchor, tracing the connection. It's tied to love, a particular love. Her hands went still. It's tied to them, to how much they love their father. Russell went very quiet. The closer King Ray gets to them, she said slowly, working it out as it came to her. The way her gift delivered information and sensation rather than language, and she had to translate it in real time, the stronger the binding becomes. Because their love for him feeds it. Every time he approaches them, every time he grieves near them, they're loving him, even in this state, and that love goes straight into the mechanism and tightens the curse. She looked up at Russell. He had gone the color of old bone. He's been visiting them, he said, every few hours. All 3 days. The physicians couldn't stop him. No one could stop him. His jaw worked. We thought it was grief. We thought he was just, he stopped. Every time he came near them, he made it worse. Yes, without knowing. Without any way of knowing. She held his gaze. Whoever built this knew him, knew his children, knew exactly how to use the love between them as a mechanism. She paused. This wasn't constructed by someone outside this palace. The words settled in the cold air between them. She watched him take them in, watched the grief and the understanding move through him simultaneously, watched the moment he arrived at the same place she had arrived at. Someone in this palace built a murder out of love, and they'd been watching it work for 3 days. My lord, she said carefully, your father cannot visit them again. Not until this is broken. You need to keep him away from that courtyard. He'll know something is wrong. He already knows something is wrong. He's been watching warriors bounce off his children's coffin for 3 days. She softened her voice slightly, because he looked suddenly, terribly young under the grief and the authority. Tell him the physicians need undisturbed time. Tell him anything that keeps him at a distance. Just until I've read my grandmother's journals. There's a passage about the nightshade. I need to read all of it before I know what breaking this will cost. Russell looked at her in the lamplight, in the rain, with his dead but not dead nephews behind the glass and the dark pulse shimmering between them, and she saw him make the decision, not the political decision, not the strategic one, but the human one. The one a man makes when he has run out of everything except one impossible option offered by one impossible person. Your name, he said. You haven't told me your name. Sherry, she said. Just Sherry. No family name? She thought of her father at the boundary stones. Her sister in the doorway. The packed silence at her back like a second exile. No, she said. Not anymore. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Sherry. As if filing it somewhere it wouldn't be lost. I'll keep my father away from the courtyard. Whatever you need from the palace library, I'll have it brought to you without questions. And, he paused, and something shifted in his expression, the alpha giving way briefly to the person underneath. Whatever this costs you. What you said, about what dark magic does to you while you're holding it, I want to know before you do anything irreversible. She looked at him for a moment, this broken prince who had not slept in 3 days and was still thinking about the cost to a maid he'd met an hour ago. I'll tell you, she said. And then, because it was true and she had stopped seeing any value in pretending things weren't, it's the first time anyone's asked. She lifted her palms from the coffin. The barrier sealed closed behind her hands. Inside it, 2 small hearts continued their slow, determined flutter against the dark, quieter now than an hour ago, but still there, still fighting in whatever deep place the paralytic had pushed them. Hold on, she thought in the wordless language of her gift. I know you're in there. I hear you, both of you. I'm not finished yet. The rain came down around the palace courtyard. The torches guttered. Somewhere above them, in the chambers he'd barely left in 3 days, Alpha King Ray sat in his armor with his hand near a sword he had nothing left to fight, not knowing that his grief was being used as a weapon against his children, not knowing that the man standing at his right shoulder had built a trap out of the very love that made him a father, and a maid that no one had ever bothered to see moved through the palace corridors with a dead woman's journals tucked under one arm and the map of a darkness she was going to have to walk into alone in the other, learning the shape of what it would cost her. Below the dirt, they'd always said, below the dirt was where roots lived, and roots, given enough darkness and enough time, had a way of breaking through stone. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know if our story reaches as far as America, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Africa. She found the journals where she'd hidden them 3 months ago, tucked behind a loose stone in the servants' washroom on the palace's lowest level, the one place in the entire building that no one of consequence ever had reason to visit. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the pages in the cramped, urgent script of someone who had written quickly and often by poor light. The ink faded in places to near invisibility, the leather covers warped from years of damp storage before. Sherry had rescued them from her father's burning pile. She'd saved 6 of the original 12. The rest were ash. She was on her knees in the narrow corridor outside the washroom, the journal spread across the stone floor. The borrowed lamp Russell had pressed into her hands before they separated, casting its small circle of gold across the pages. When she heard the footsteps, she knew them before she looked up. She had spent enough years in the same house with those footsteps to recognize their particular rhythm, the deliberate, weighted placement of someone who had learned early that presence was power and had been practicing ever since. Chandra came around the corner and stopped. She looked at Sherry the way she always had, with the specific contempt of someone who has spent years constructing their own importance on the foundation of another person's diminishment. She was beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful, precise, cold, meant to cut. Her palace uniform was immaculate despite the late hour, her dark hair arranged, her posture the aggressive straightness of a woman who had worked very hard to be exactly where she was. Sherry closed the journal in her lap. She did not stand up. There was no version of this encounter in which standing up would give her an advantage, and she had learned to stop spending energy on gestures. I heard you were seen near the coffins, Chandra said. Her voice was quiet. That was the thing about Chandra. She had never needed volume. She did her damage in undertones. With the prince, people see many things. Don't. Chandra crossed her arms, tilting her head with the small, patient smile that Sherry recognized as its most dangerous configuration. Don't do that thing where you act simple. You were never simple. That was always the problem. Sherry waited. You're going to walk away from this, Chandra said. You're going to put those journals back behind whatever wall you pulled them from, and you're going to finish your shift. And tomorrow you're going to be reassigned to the East Wing laundry where you won't have any reason to be near the courtyard. I've already spoken to the head steward. You've spoken to the head steward, Sherry said. He's accommodating. A pause. He finds me persuasive. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere down the corridor. In its shifting light, Sherry studied her sister's face and looked for the thing that had always been beneath the contempt, the thing she'd spent years trying to name and had finally, in her second winter alone at the forest boundary, understood. Not hatred, something more complicated. The particular poison of a person who has watched someone else possess something they wanted and couldn't take, and has spent years making sure that person can't use it either. You know what's in those coffins, Sherry said. Not a question. Something moved across Chandra's face too quickly to catch. I know what everyone knows. The sleeping plague. Don't. Sherry used her sister's own word back at her. Don't do that thing where you act ignorant. You were never ignorant either. The silence that followed had weight. Walk away, Sherry. Chandra's voice had lost its surface pleasantness, the undertone showing through. You have nothing here. No status. No protection. No one in this palace will believe a rejected Omega Maid over anything, over anyone. If you make noise about this, they won't investigate what you're claiming. They'll investigate you. I know, Sherry said. I've always known that. It didn't stop me before. Chandra's jaw tightened. Father tried to stop you before. He cast you out. That should have been enough. Why did he cast me out? Sherry asked. She had asked herself the version of this question for 2 years, but she had never asked Chandra directly, because she had never, until this moment, been in a position where Chandra might answer. Not the reason he gave the pack. The real one. The pause that followed was a fraction too long for denial. He was afraid of you, Chandra said finally, and there was something in it that almost sounded like the truth, stripped of strategy. Not of what you do on purpose. Of what you do by accident. Of what you'd become if anyone ever told you that you were allowed to. She looked at the journals on the floor between them. He knew what grandmother's blood meant. He knew what it could do to the established order if it ever found a reason to activate. He thought if he broke you down small enough, early enough, it would never matter. And you? Sherry asked. What did you know? Another pause. I knew he was right to be afraid. She said it without apology, meeting Sherry's eyes. I still think he's right. Then why are you here warning me instead of reporting me? The question landed and sat there. Chandra's expression shifted through several things in quick succession, none of which she let resolve into anything readable. Then, very quietly, very controlled, because whatever happens to those pups, the consequences will be catastrophic for a lot of people. Some of those people made choices they can't take back. Some of them were. She stopped, rearranged. Walk away, Sherry. Some things can't be undone. What did father do? Sherry said. Chandra, what did he do? Her sister looked at her for a long moment. And in that moment, in the lamplight, in the narrow corridor, 2 daughters of the same frightened man, Sherry saw it. The thing underneath the contempt and the calculation and the careful self-preservation. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a person who had done something they couldn't confess to and had been carrying it in the dark for days. His blood, Chandra said, barely audible. They needed old blood for the anchor. For the ritual to hold at that depth, it had to be bound in old blood, the same line as the one who could theoretically break it. Her voice was very flat, the flatness of someone reciting rather than choosing words. He supplied it. He thought, he was told, it was for something else. Something that wouldn't. She stopped again. He gave them his blood, Sherry said, knowing what it would be used to bind. He didn't know the children would be involved. The words came out fast, with the force of something that had been held under pressure. He didn't know what Tommy, she caught herself, pressed her lips together, looked, for one fractured second, like the girl Sherry half remembered from before everything had become competition and survival. Then the expression closed. It doesn't matter now, Chandra said. Her voice was back to its controlled undertone. It's done. The ritual exists. The binding holds. Walk away, and when this is over, whatever over looks like, there might still be a version of this where the people involved aren't destroyed. The pups will die, Sherry said. If I walk away, they will die. Not soon, slowly. The nightshade lines are spreading. They have until moonrise tomorrow before the corruption reaches their hearts. After that, I know, Chandra said, very quietly. I know. The admission sat between them. Sherry looked at her sister, at the woman who had stood in a doorway and watched their father throw her across a boundary stone and said nothing, who had spent years as the blade their father sharpened when he wanted Sherry diminished, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not forgiveness. Not yet, and possibly not ever, but something adjacent to understanding. The particular sadness of recognizing that the people who hurt you were also trapped in the architecture of their own fear. Then you know I can't walk away, Sherry said. Chandra looked at the floor, at the journals, at some middle distance that had nothing in it. Then she straightened, and the controlled mask came fully back down, and she turned to leave. She stopped once, at the corridor's turn, her back to Sherry. Grandmother always said you were the one who got the real gift, she said. She said I got the echo of it and you got the source. A beat. I hated you for that. I want you to know that I know that's a terrible reason to help someone destroy children. She turned the corner and was gone. Sherry sat in the lamplight with her grandmother's journals and the shape of a betrayal that went all the way down to the blood that had built the trap she was walking into. She opened the journal again. She had work to do. She heard about the decree secondhand, the way she heard about everything important, through the walls, through the gaps between important people, through the particular acoustic mercy of palace corridors that were old enough to carry sound in ways their builders hadn't anticipated. Prince Tommy had gone to the king at dawn. She was in the library alcove Russell had arranged for her, a back room, small, smelling of must and forgotten scholarship, with a door that locked from the inside, when the voices reached her from the corridor outside. Two servants, passing quickly, speaking in the hushed urgent tones of people carrying news that frightened them. The pups were to be cremated, not buried. The earth had refused them, the barrier remained, and Prince Tommy had apparently spent the last 3 hours constructing an argument for King Ray that was, from what the servants reported in fragmented horror, both logically impeccable and utterly calculated. The sleeping plague, Tommy had said, was not merely an illness. It was a supernatural contamination. The invisible force protecting the coffins was not a sign of cursed children. It was a sign of a curse within the children, a dark infection that was keeping them in an in-between state, neither living nor dead, feeding on the kingdom's grief. The only merciful solution, the only way to end both the pups' suffering and the contamination's hold on the palace, was fire. Fire that left no residue. Fire that closed the door between worlds cleanly. Tommy had wept when he said it. Reportedly, the servants' voices carried a thread of the particular discomfort that came from watching a man perform grief so convincingly that the audience felt guilty for the doubt. King Ray had agreed. The cremation would happen at moonrise. Sherry set down her grandmother's journal and held very still for a moment, doing the mathematics of time. Moonrise was 6 hours away. The nightshade lines she'd observed through the glass had been perhaps 12 hours from the pups' hearts when she'd last seen them, which meant the timing was not accidental. Tommy had chosen a moment when the children were close enough to the threshold of genuine death that the fire would be, in a certain terrible sense, a mercy rather than a murder. He had arranged it so that the king would believe he was ending suffering rather than ending lives. And if she was right, if the nightshade reached their hearts before she could unmake the binding, then the cremation would be redundant. They would already be gone. She picked the journal back up with hands that were very steady, because there was no time for them to be anything else. The passage she needed was near the back, in the section her grandmother had titled in the old script, roughly translated, The Cost of Carrying. She had read it twice already in the hours since she'd retrieved the journals. She read it a third time now, slowly, making sure she understood every word, because this was the kind of thing you needed to understand completely before you committed to it. The Nightshade Curse, in its bound form, was not something that could be absorbed incrementally. It was not a pain she could take in gradually, the way she took in ordinary illness, a little at a time, a slow dilution until the wrong thing had nowhere left to concentrate. The binding held it in a compressed state, a knot of dark magic pulled tight around the paralytic, and when the knot was untied it would release in full. Everything at once. The entire weight of the corruption, the entire cold mechanism of the ritual, the nightshade venom, blood anchor, the soul-binding geometry, would need somewhere to go in the moment it was unmade. It would need to go into her. All of it. At once. Her grandmother's notation in the margin beside this passage was characteristically direct. The absorber must be willing to receive the complete corruption without resistance. Any resistance will fragment the release and drive the fragments deeper into the subject. Full reception only. This is not survivable by ordinary healers. Old blood may hold. Sherry looked at that word for a long time. Then she thought about 2 small heartbeats against her palm, getting slower. She thought about a king standing in his armor with his hand on a sword he couldn't use. She thought about Russell's voice in the rain asking, "Can I trust that?" and the way he had given her his cloak without ceremony, and the way no one had asked her what something would cost her before. She closed the journal. She went to find Prince Russell. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was his particular form of respect, the willingness to receive difficult information completely before responding to it, the discipline of a man who had learned that the first instinct in a crisis was rarely the right one. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Then, there's a variant. Another way. There has to be. I've read every relevant passage 3 times. Then we find someone else to do it. Someone with old blood. My blood is the anchor's opposite. That's not incidental. That's why the barrier recognized me and stood down. My grandmother's line is specifically what was used to build the ritual, which means my grandmother's line is specifically what can unmake it. Anyone else attempting this would be destroyed by the release immediately. I have a chance of holding it. A chance, he said, flat. Not a question. A chance, she agreed. He looked at the wall for a moment. She could see him working through it. The alpha part of him that dealt in strategy and acceptable losses, and the human part of him that was looking at a woman in a servant's dress who had spent 2 years being told she was worth nothing and was now proposing to spend whatever was left of herself saving his family. What do you need? He asked finally. Access to the courtyard before moonrise. Alone, no guards, no witnesses, no one near the coffin who's carrying fear. And you need to keep your father away from the courtyard no matter what happens. She held his gaze. No matter what. Even if he hears something. Even if Tommy's men come looking for me, who hold the line at the courtyard entrance. What happens inside that barrier is going to look wrong from the outside. And if anyone interrupts it mid-process. I understand. He held her gaze. What happens to you if it works? She thought about her grandmother's margin note. May, I don't know exactly, she said, which was the truth if not the whole truth. Arc magic at that volume, it changes things. Some of it will dissolve. Some of it may leave marks. She touched the inside of her own wrist, tracing the path the Nightshade lines had taken on the pups. But they'll be alive, and the binding will be broken, and Tommy will have nothing left to hide behind. Russell looked at her for a long time, long enough that she began to feel the weight of it, particular heaviness of being seen clearly by someone who wasn't pretending to see something else. You know, he said quietly, when I found you at that coffin, I'd been standing in the shadows watching the barrier throw back my father's finest warriors for an hour. I'd already started to believe that there was no answer, that whatever had been done to them was simply going to finish. He paused. I watched you walk up and press your hand against it like it was nothing, like you'd decided the outcome before you arrived. I hadn't, she said. I just didn't have enough left to be afraid. No. He shook his head slightly. That's not what I saw. What I saw was someone who had decided that the answer mattered more than the cost. He held her gaze. Don't let them tell you that was nothing. Whatever happens tonight, don't let anyone tell you that was nothing. She had no answer for that. She was not accustomed to having no answer. She looked away first, which had never happened before in any conversation she could remember, and gathered the journals under her arm and moved toward the door. Sherry. His voice stopped her. After this, when it's done and the pups are breathing and my father knows the truth, you don't go back to scrubbing floors. She looked back at him. That's not a discussion, he said. That's a fact. She left before she said something her 2 years of careful invisibility would never forgive her for. The palace watchtower stood at the north corner of the courtyard wall, 3 stories of ancient stone with a parapet view of the entire funeral ground. Sherry had climbed it twice before in her life, once in her first week at the palace, exploring the parts of the building that servants were technically permitted to access, and once to fix a stuck drainage pipe that the maintenance staff had been ignoring for a month. Both times, she had noted that it offered a direct sight line to the courtyard, unobstructed. Both times, she had filed the information away without knowing why. She understood why now. She reached the courtyard as the sky was beginning its shift toward the particular deep blue that preceded moonrise, still dark, but with a quality of waiting in it, the atmosphere holding its breath. The torches along the palace walls had been replaced with fresh ones in preparation for the cremation ceremony. Their light made the rain-slicked stones glow amber, and the coffin at the courtyard center sat in a circle of that amber light like something placed on an altar. Beside it, 2 palace guards were positioning a metal cradle, the structure that would hold the coffin over the fire. They had their backs to her. She moved along the colonnade's shadow and arrived at the coffin's side without either of them registering her presence. Still useful, she thought. Being invisible. She heard the door at the far end of the courtyard open before she saw Tommy come through it. He was not alone. He had 4 of the palace guard with him, loyal ones. She recognized 2 of them from the inner corridor rotations, men she'd seen speak to Tommy with the particular deference that went beyond rank into personal allegiance. He was dressed for ceremony, his mourning attire precise, his expression arranged in the grief mask he'd apparently been wearing for 3 days without anyone examining it closely enough to see the seams. He was carrying a torch. He hadn't expected anyone to be at the coffin. She could tell by the way he stopped mid-stride when he saw her, the small, recalibrating hesitation of a man encountering an element his plan hadn't accounted for. Then his expression resolved into something that wore patience like a weapon. The maid, he said, His voice was pleasant. That was the thing about Tommy that the servants had always whispered about, the pleasantness. A king's face wearing a monster's will, or perhaps the other way around. "You're up late." "So are you, my lord," she said. He looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, she suspected, despite the fact that she'd been in this palace for 2 years. The look was the one she'd always feared from him, not the contempt that was easy to absorb, but the calculation. The specific assessment of someone who was deciding what category of problem she represented and what category of solution applied. "Step away from the coffin," he said. Same words as Russell, 3 days ago. Different weight entirely. "No," she said. One of the guards moved. She felt rather than saw it, a shift in the air behind her, and she placed both hands flat on the coffin lid before he could reach her. The barrier surged upward through her palms, and she absorbed its first wave without resisting, letting it crash through her and break apart, and she heard the guard stumble back with a sharp intake of breath as the residual energy shunted outward from her body. Tommy's eyes went very still. The pleasantness didn't leave his face, but something behind it sharpened into something with edges. "Interesting," he said. "My lord." She kept her voice steady. "I know what's in this coffin. I know it's not plague. I know about the nightshade binding and the blood anchor, and I know whose blood was used." She watched for the reaction, the flicker, the involuntary assessment of how much she knew and how much of a problem that made her. "I know everything. And Prince Russell knows everything I know." Russell, Tommy said, is currently being briefed on a security situation in the East Wing that will occupy him for the next hour. A pause. The head steward is accommodating. Another pause, and something in his voice took on an almost admiring quality. "You're the maid he's been meeting with." I wondered. He tilted his head. "A rejected Omega with old blood. That's why the barrier let you through." "That's actually," a brief, genuine appreciation crossed his face. "That's actually quite elegant. I should have anticipated that variable." "The variable you didn't anticipate," she said, "is that I'm going to unmake it. You're going to unmake a nightshade binding." He said it the way you repeat something from a child who has said something ambitious and incorrect. "By yourself." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed the distance between them in 4 measured steps, and she understood that he had moved from the calculation phase into the action phase and that the pleasantness was fully gone now. And what was underneath it was not rage. It was the cold patience of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply implementing it. "I don't need you to move," he said, very quietly, very close. "I need you to stop breathing. Those are different problems and different solutions." He raised the torch. Sherry turned away from him, pressed both palms against the coffin lid, and dove. There was no other word for it. No other way to describe the experience of opening yourself completely to a tide of dark magic and choosing not to resist any of it. It was a dive, a full-body commitment, the irreversible kind, the kind where the moment you leave the edge there is no returning to the position you held before. The barrier broke across her like cold water over stone and she swallowed it whole. The nightshade binding came next, the outer layer first, the geometric web of constructed malice, and she felt it enter her like ice entering her blood, and she held herself open, did not flinch or push back or let the self-preservation instinct seal her off. The cold moved through her arms, her shoulders, down her spine, and she heard herself make a sound that wasn't pain exactly but was the closest physical language available for the sensation of holding something that wanted to destroy you and refusing to drop it. The blood anchor followed. She felt it, her father's blood in the ritual, the old blood used to pin the mechanism in place, and it recognized her because it was her bloodline, and the recognition hit her like a physical blow, a shock of connection she hadn't prepared for, the terrible intimacy of a wrong thing built from the right materials. She held that too. She held it all. Her veins went dark. She could see them. She looked down at the inside of her forearm and saw the nightshade lines traveling up from her wrists exactly as they'd traveled up the pup's wrists, branching and spreading, the corruption moving into her as it moved out of them. Her hands were still on the coffin lid. She could feel the mechanism unwinding, the paralytic releasing its grip on 2 small bodies inside the box, the binding thinning and fraying as she drew the weight of it into herself. She was aware of Tommy moving, aware of his hand closing on her shoulder, aware of him pulling her back from the coffin with a force that should have broken her grip, but she was anchored, not by strength. She didn't have that kind of strength, but by the connection. The binding recognized her as its natural terminus. It was flowing into her the way water flows downhill, following the path of least resistance, and Tommy pulling at her body was like pulling at the edge of a river while the current ran the other way. He couldn't stop it. She could hear him speaking orders to the guards, sharp and stripped of pleasantness now, the voice of a man watching a plan come apart in real time. She could hear the guards moving. She could hear the torch flame in the wind. She could hear, beneath all of it, beginning to grow louder as the binding thinned and finally, a sound. Two sounds, small, searching. The sounds of lungs that had been still for 3 days, finding air and not knowing quite what to do with it yet. The corruption hit its final stage and she took it in without resisting and felt it spread through her chest like black water filling a room, cold and enormous and wrong, and her vision went dark at the edges and she thought, with a clarity that seemed to exist outside of the pain, oh, so this is what this costs. Then she heard it distinctly, unmistakably, 2 voices, not words yet, just the raw, instinctive sound of new life asserting itself, of small creatures who had been pulled back from a very long way away and were, against all constructed odds, here, crying. The twin pups were crying. The next thing she was aware of came in fragments, disordered, the way consciousness reassembles itself after it's been scattered. Stone under her cheek, cold. The rain had stopped, or she was inside. She couldn't tell yet. Voices, multiple, one of them low and controlled and familiar, running words together in a pattern she recognized as Russell even before the words resolved into meaning. Another voice, louder, with a quality that moved the air differently. The voice of a man who was accustomed to the world reorganizing itself around his decisions and was currently in the process of reorganizing it in real time. The king's voice. A third sound, crying, continuous, healthy, demanding. The particular crying of warm living things that had been cold and still for too long and were now expressing everything they'd been unable to express, all at once, at full volume. She opened her eyes. The courtyard's ceiling was above her, open sky, deep blue gone gray with approaching dawn, the torches burning low. Someone had moved her away from the coffin. She was lying against the base of one of the stone pillars, and Russell was kneeling beside her, and his expression when he saw her open her eyes was the kind that people tried to compose into something neutral when they were not succeeding. "You're awake," he said. "Apparently," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she'd expected. "The pups are awake. Both of them. My father has them." He paused. "He won't put them down." She turned her head. Across the courtyard, in the amber torchlight, she could see Alpha King Ray, towering, dark-armored, a jagged crown still on his head as if he'd forgotten it was there, crouched on the wet stone with 2 small bodies pressed against his chest, his arms curved around them in the specific posture of a person holding something they believed they'd already lost. His shoulders were shaking, the stone-cold mountain of him, reduced to this. 2 heartbeats restored, pressed against the armor that had been keeping the grief out, finally and completely undone by the thing that had been trying to undo him all along. Love. Just love. But his love, and theirs, and not weaponized anymore. She looked at her own arms. The nightshade lines were still there, faded from black to the deep gray of old bruising, but there. Her grandmother's journals had said marks might remain. She traced one with her finger, following its path from wrist to inner elbow, and felt it, not pain exactly, but a persistent cold in those channels, the residue of something that had moved through her and not entirely left. May, she thought, old blood may hold. It had held. "Tommy," she said, "is in the custody of my father's guard," Russell said. "Has been for the last 20 minutes, since the twins started crying and my father came out of the East Wing briefing, which turned out to be considerably less of a security situation than advertised, and found Tommy at the courtyard entrance with a torch and 4 armed men standing over an Omega Maid who appeared to be absorbing dark magic through her hands." A pause. "My father is a man of very few words in moments of crisis, but the words he had for Tommy were extensive and specific. "Chandra," Sherry said. "I know about Chandra." He said it simply, without elaboration, which told her he'd either already spoken to her sister or had been told what he needed to know by other means. "She came to me, after she left you. She told me everything she knew about the ritual and the blood anchor and Tommy's arrangement with your father." A pause. "She's speaking to my father's advisors now." Voluntarily. Sherry absorbed this. Something in her chest shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, possibly not for a long time, but a small, quiet acknowledgement that her sister had arrived, at the last possible moment, at the choice Sherry had always hoped she was capable of making. "Your father," she started. "Melvin," Russell's voice was careful, "is a separate matter, with consequences proportional to his involvement, which my father will determine." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to carry that either. Not tonight." She looked at the king across the courtyard, his armored shoulders curved over his children, 2 small voices raised in the normal, unremarkable, extraordinary complaint of the living. Then she looked at the coffin that had sat in this courtyard for 3 days while the kingdom whispered about curses and warriors bounced off its barrier and a rejected Omega Maid scrubbed mud from the ceremonial stones and heard what nobody else heard. Help me up, she said. You should rest, Russell. She looked at him directly. Help me up. He helped her up. She was steadier than she'd expected. The cold in her arms was persistent but manageable, and her legs, after a moment of recalibration, held her weight without argument. She straightened the damp servant's dress that had been her armor for 3 days and pushed her wet hair back from her face with both hands and looked at the courtyard around her, the guards, the advisors, the assembled members of the palace who had materialized in the last 20 minutes as word of something impossible spread through corridors at the speed that extraordinary things always spread. All of them looking at her. She was not invisible anymore. Alpha King Ray lifted his head from his children. He was not a man who cried. She could see that in the architecture of his face, the particular discipline built into a man who had been a king for long enough that the performance of grief in public had become impossible. But his eyes, when they found her across the courtyard, were not dry, and his posture, still curved over the twins, was not the rigid authority of the man who had stood at the circle's edge for 3 days with his hand on a sword. He looked like a father, just a father, holding his children in the rain-washed dawn. He looked at Sherry for a long moment. Then he crossed the courtyard toward her, his children pressed against his chest. One of them had subsided into the sleepy, snuffling aftermath of crying. The other was still watching the world with the wide, uncertain eyes of a creature reacquainting itself with the concept of being alive, and stopped in front of her. He was a very large man. Up close, the armor was even more imposing, the crown even more severe. The raw, unguarded look on his face was more imposing than either. He looked at her arms, at the gray lines tracing their paths from her wrists to her elbows, the marks the corruption had left in its passage through her. Something moved across his expression that was too large and too complicated to have a simple name. They told me what you did, he said. His voice was low. Russell told me. Chandra told me. My own advisors told me, though they barely believed it themselves. He paused. What I want to know is why. You had nothing to gain. No status, no protection, no reason to risk yourself for. He stopped, looked at her face. You didn't know them. No, she said. I didn't. Then why? She thought about it. She thought about the faint heartbeats she'd heard in the silence, the 2 small rhythms pressing against the dark. She thought about 2 years at a forest boundary learning the difference between surviving and living. She thought about her grandmother's journals, the cramped urgent handwriting of a woman who had known what her blood was capable of and written it down in the hope that someone would eventually read it and understand. Because I heard them, she said, and I was the only one who could. And that seemed like enough of a reason. King Ray looked at her for a long time. Then he did something that would be discussed in palace corridors for years afterward, in the specific reverent tones that people use when they witness something that doesn't fit inside the available categories of the world. He went down on one knee. The Alpha King, in his dark armor and his jagged crown, with his children in his arms, knelt in front of a rejected Omega Maid on the rain-wet stones of his courtyard in the first light of a dawn that had not been guaranteed. Round them, the court held its collective breath. Sherry, he said, her name in his mouth, plain and unadorned, without title or rank or any of the distancing language of hierarchy. Just her name. This kingdom owes you a debt that protocol doesn't have language for. I don't have language for it. He looked at her steadily. But I will spend however long I have finding the right words. She looked at him, at the children in his arms, one drowsy, one watchful, at Russell standing 3 feet behind her with an expression that was carefully composed and not entirely succeeding, at the courtyard, the cracked pillars, the amber torches burning low, the empty platform where the coffin had sat for 3 days, and the gray dawn breaking above the castle walls. She had been below the dirt. She had spent 2 years in the space between the boundary stones and the forest arc, learning what you become when the world decides you don't exist. She had come into this palace invisible and stayed invisible because invisibility was a kind of safety and safety was what you settled for when mattering seemed too ambitious. She had heard 2 heartbeats in the silence when everyone else heard nothing. She had decided that was enough. She looked at Alpha King Ray, kneeling in the dawn with his children, and felt something she recognized after a long moment as the quiet, complete, uncomplicated feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be. Stand up, my lord, she said. You have your children back. That's enough words for now. He stood. One of the twins, watchful one, reached out a small, pale paw and grabbed her finger with the uncomplicated authority of a creature that had just come back from a very long way away and found the first warm thing available and decided to hold on. Sherry looked down at the small grip around her finger, at the gray lines on her arm, at the dawn coming up over the castle walls. She let herself be held. Subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next story, and also comment below where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story goes.